House Speaker Mike Johnson, his job on the line. Will he last the month? Overnight, he went on the offense for the first time. Protesters flooding the streets of Jerusalem this morning, calling for the removal of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as key talks between Israel and the Biden administration back on for today. And as of this morning, the number of measles cases have now surpassed all of 2023. And it's only April, barely. What you need to know about the rising health risk. Kate is out. I'm John Berman with Sarah Seidner, and this is CNN News Central.
Donald Trump launching an all-out verbal attack on prosecutors and judges in the criminal cases against him. He's facing a month filled with crucial legal challenges. In an Easter Day post on Truth Social, the former president went after special counsel Jack Smith, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, and Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. Those attacks coming as he faces three big legal dates this month. You see them there, the 4th, the 15th, and the 25th of April. The criminal trial for the New York hush money case set to begin just 2 weeks from today. CNN's Zach Cohen is joining us now. Zach, these increased attacks are really fueling concerns about security for those he is going after. There is already a gag order in place in one of the cases.
Yes, Sarah, that's right. Look, Donald Trump using his Easter Day message to do what we've seen him do so many times already, go after and attack the prosecutors and the judges who are overseeing and prosecuting him in these criminal cases. He name-checks Jack Smith, the special counsel, who is prosecuting him in two different criminal cases. He also mentions DA Fani Willis down in Georgia, who is running the criminal case against him there, and Alvin Bragg, the DA in New York. But what we've seen really that has drawn a lot of concern due to the proximity of the upcoming trial are his attacks against the judge overseeing his New York hush money case. That's a trial, as you mentioned, that is scheduled to begin in about 2 weeks. It's overseen by Judge Merchan. And Trump has not only attacked Judge Merchan personally, but singled out his daughter as well. And those concerns fueling criticism from retired and current judges who have said they've really never seen any other defendant in their courtroom behave the way Trump is. And some even warning that his attacks on prosecutors and judges could really undermine the future of democracy and the judicial system. Just on a practical level, the security concerns that these comments are raising do, in the opinion of U.S. District Judge Reggie Walton, they do fuel concerns that judges can't do their jobs if they're constantly worried about threats and their own security. So a lot of concerns around here, and Donald Trump obviously continuing to ramp up his attacks, and we don't expect those concerns to stem those attacks from Donald Trump. There's also a political element here too, and we've seen this play out over throughout Trump's presidency and in the time since, where Republicans really are not eager and are not willing to criticize Donald Trump directly for comments like this. Listen to what Congressman Mike Lawler, who is a Republican from New York, but won in one of those swing districts in New York, how he tried to walk the line and really underscored the way Republicans are trying to delicately address what Donald Trump is saying.
I think everyone needs to tone down the rhetoric, the language, and, obviously social media has become a vehicle by which to bludgeon people. I just think at the end of the day, the former president, current president, and on down, all of us have a responsibility to check our language, to watch what we're saying.
So our colleague Stephen Collinson made a good point in his article today on CNN.com that ultimately at the end of the day, if this election is not about health care and the Republican policy on the economy, it is going to be because of Donald Trump and Donald Trump trying to make this election about him and about the criminal proceedings against him. Ultimately, if he wins, that could be validated. And if he loses, we'll have to look back at some of the comments like he's been making in recent weeks.
Zach Cohen, thank you so much for that reporting. John?
Or with me now, CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Jennifer Rogers. Just very quickly, when it comes to gag orders, there are generally carve-outs, or there have been, for the prosecutors and the judges. Why?
For carve-outs in terms of
carve-outs in terms of what people can say about Donald Trump can say whatever he wants about prosecutors and judges.
Right. Well, they have to be narrowly drafted in order to be constitutional. And the notion is that the bold-faced names, if you will, the judge, the DA, they are public officials, and the DA is an elected official, right? They can take the heat. And you really do have to allow litigants to say some things. I mean, Trump wants to attack the process. He wants to attack some people. So that kind of gives them a way to have middle ground there.
When it comes to the judge's family, though, which is what's happening here in the New York case, how is that different?
Well, there's no justification for attacking family members, right? They're private citizens, they're not public officials in any way, and they don't have anything to do with the process. I mean, what's the point of attacking someone who isn't actually involved or participating in the trial? So for those reasons, it makes sense to carve them out. He can say what he needs to say to defend himself and attack the process and so on, but not put into danger people who have really nothing to do with it.
Do you think here in New York that they could, the Judge Merchan could explicitly widen the scope of this gag order given everything that Donald Trump is saying?
Oh, definitely. And the DA's office has asked him to do that. They've said, we want some clarification. Really, it would be an expansion, I think. But they want the DA's family and the judge's family to be explicitly added to the categories of people who cannot be attacked under this gag order.
And then the question becomes, Jen, what happens if and when Donald Trump crosses the line? What incentive is there for him to stop short of going over that line?
So in a normal case, you would start with a warning and then progress to a fine, and then only after, a few steps get to jail. The DA's letter mentions criminal contempt as an option for Judge Merchan if he finds that Donald Trump continues to violate the order. So under that provision, you would have a fine and then jail up to 30 days. So we'll see what the judge does. I will say he has not violated the current order in place. So it's possible that even if the judge expands it to include family members of Alvin Bragg and Judge Merchan, that he will stay within the bounds of the new order. But as he gets more desperate, as trial comes closer, we'll see whether he can do that or not.
He may have a political incentive. Look, how much does Donald Trump care about a fine? I mean, that's the question. That becomes a political question, not so much a legal one, but is a fine enough to keep him from saying something?
Probably not. Prison probably would be, but I know the judge won't want to go there, and just the logistical and security nightmare that it would be to try to put him in for any period of time, I think the judge wants to stay
in the New York civil case is a different animal, right? Judge Engoron was the judge and the jury in this case, the only person overseeing the whole thing and making the decision. In the New York criminal case, if Donald Trump continues to poke at the judge, poke at the judge's family, how could that impact Trump in the trial itself?
Well, in theory, it shouldn't, right? I mean, the judge is neutral. He's supposed to put his biases to the side, and presumably he can. But most people think if you continue to anger the judge, he's not just the person overseeing the trial, making the evidentiary rulings and so on. He would sentence Donald Trump if he's convicted in this trial. So the notion of, do you want to keep attacking the judge like that when this is the person who holds your fate in his hands at sentencing, is that smart?
Selection and whatnot. A very, very big month for Donald Trump. Jennifer Rogers, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.
Sarah? Marjorie Taylor Greene's threat to oust him. He's now going on offense, really for the first time, even calling her motion to vacate, quote, a distraction from our mission. He's also strategizing with Matt Gaetz on how to keep the gavel with funding for Ukraine on the line. CNN congressional correspondent Lauren Fox joins us now. He's got this thin margin, and he's got to find a way to live with it for the next month.
Yeah, and if you remember, right before the recess, Marjorie Taylor Greene firing this kind of warning shot. Now, she has not said that this is definitely the step she is going to take, but she is warning Speaker Johnson, you're on notice. And so in the meantime, everyone around her and everyone around Speaker Johnson is really maneuvering behind the scenes to try to avert what they view could be a political crisis for Republicans. What you have right now with Speaker Johnson is behind the scenes, he is seeking guidance from, as you pointed out, Matt Gaetz, the very man who brought the resolution to oust Kevin McCarthy back in October. And the guidance he's getting from Gaetz, according to this great reporting from our colleagues Melanie Zanona, Annie Greer, and Manu Raju, is that Matt Gaetz is arguing they need to get some Republican wins on the board. But that could be very difficult for Speaker Johnson in the months ahead. That's because he's already given some signs that he could move on Ukraine aid in some form or fashion. Now, what state that actually takes remains to be seen. They could structure this with some kind of loan program. He's still working out those details, but that's something else that House conservatives do not want to see on the floor. Meanwhile, Speaker Johnson making a political argument that Marjorie Taylor Greene may want to rethink her decision-making process here. Here's what he said.
How does this motion to vacate help win back the majority or win a bigger majority? I don't think it does. And I think all of my other Republican colleagues recognize this is a distraction from our mission. Again, the mission is to save the republic. And the only way we can do that is if we grow the House majority, win the Senate, and win the White House. So we don't need any dissension right now.
And Speaker Johnson could talk to Marjorie Taylor Greene this week, have some kind of conversation. He is really known behind the scenes as someone who is really affable, someone who's very friendly. Perhaps a lot of conservatives view him as much less defensive than Kevin McCarthy. He is someone who's tried to have a good relationship with many Republicans. And again, it's not clear Marjorie Taylor Greene would have the votes to actually move forward with this, John. But again, she made it very clear that Speaker Johnson is on notice, at least with her.
Yes, unlike double secret or double not so secret probation maybe right now, Lauren. The Matt Gaetz path forward, getting Republican wins. What's available? I mean, especially given that the impeachment of President Biden seems to have fallen flat completely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back to the fall when Kevin McCarthy was in trouble. Remember, he announced that they were going to be moving forward with an impeachment inquiry before they even had a vote on the floor of the House. And that was really seen as an effort by McCarthy to try to stop the right flank from moving forward with this motion to vacate. Now, eventually that didn't work, but Speaker Johnson really doesn't have that tool at his disposal because everyone knows right now the votes aren't there to move forward with impeachment. Is there something else he could do? If you keep in mind the fact that they have moved forward with impeaching Secretary Mayorkas, that's one victory he gave conservatives. There's other pet legislation that lawmakers always have that potentially he could bring to the floor. But the reason it's so difficult to get some of those conservative wins is he has majority makers, people who are running in swing districts who don't want to vote on red meat Republican legislation in an election year, and he has such a narrow margin that if he brings something to the floor, he either has to pass it, or if he's just bringing it to the floor to make conservatives happy, knowing it won't pass, he gets the ear of those governing Republicans who argue he's not an efficient leader. So that's the really difficult position that Speaker Johnson is finding himself in.
April could be a very long month for Speaker Johnson, or not. Maybe a short month this Speaker. We'll see.
Presidential election. Black voter turnout, particularly among black men, has dropped over the last decade. There is a big effort by Democrats to reverse that trend ahead of the November election. CNN's Isaac Dovere is joining us now from Washington. There is a primary that's coming up in Wisconsin tomorrow. Is that going to be a place where they'll sort of look to see if some of the work they've been trying to do is actually having an impact?
Yeah, it's a primary tomorrow. It's also local elections in a bunch of places around the state, and that is where they've been road testing a lot of things in Wisconsin to see about changing up this outreach to black voters. I was there a week ago looking at some of the things going on there. Remember, Wisconsin is a state that went to Donald Trump by 21,000 votes in 2016, by 23,000 votes to Joe Biden in 2020. It is going to likely be a very close state, and black voter turnout is a huge part of that, especially in and around Milwaukee. The Biden campaign is looking at a lot of ways that they can try to reach out to black voters. Again, as you mentioned, this is not just about getting people to vote for Biden or Trump. This is about getting people to vote at all. Black voter turnout has been in a real decline over the last couple of elections, and black men especially, a huge focus for the campaign to get them to show up for President Biden, to connect with what he's been doing, and to be there in November when they think that they will need those votes to win the state.
Isaac Dovere, thank you so much for your reporting, John.
Here's an interesting twist on all of that. New this morning, Axios reports that if Donald Trump wins the election, there are plans to focus the Justice Department on what they call anti-white racism. As Axios puts it, this would be an attempt to radically alter the government's interpretation of civil rights laws. With me, the host of The Big Deal with Errol Lewis on Spectrum News, CNN contributor Errol Lewis, and senior politics reporter for Axios, Eugene Scott. And Eugene, let's start with you. This is Axios reporting this morning. Anti-white racism will be a major focus of a new Trump Justice Department?
It will. There have been a number of organizations, Trump-aligned organizations, such as America First Legal, headed by former Trump aide Stephen Miller, that have gained traction over the last few years, be it quietly, in trying to overturn a number of policies and programs that they believe discriminate against white people. This should be viewed as a continuation of the Supreme Court's overturning of affirmative action. And one of the things they really are hoping to do is attack landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and just get it removed, or at least make it prioritize white people who feel like they've been discriminated against.
Pretty interesting in the context of what Isaac was just reporting, Errol, that President Biden is trying to reach out to black voters who, may be leaning toward maybe not voting, but here you go with the Trump Justice Department focusing on whites?
Yeah, well, look, the Republican Party, the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, got 8% of the black vote 4 years ago. It sounds like they're writing the script for that to be repeated. There have been a couple of outlier polls suggesting that Trump might get 23% of the black vote, that sort of a thing. But I think some of your reporting and some of what we've seen in past elections suggests that they're going to revert to type, that they're going to be divisive, that they're going to try and polarize the electorate, organize white voters, and try and pull out one more victory that way. It's a risky and in some ways undignified strategy, but it sounds like that's what the Trump folks are prepared to do.
Is this just a policy plan, Eugene, or does the Trump campaign plan to highlight that this is something that they would do if he's elected again?
Well, I think they're going to be more vocal about it as the election moves on, as the campaign moves on. The reality is the main strategy that we've seen from the Trump campaign right now is to lean in, hopefully turning out their base. And the reality is that this is a concern of many of the voters in their base. It's not obviously a huge concern of people outside of their base and swing voters who they need to attract if they're going to be successful in a number of states. And so how they're going to figure out a way to communicate this and keep the people they need to turn out without alienating the people who would be offended by this remains to be seen.
Let's shift gears now to House Speaker Mike Johnson, who will be down to a single vote majority shortly, which is just next to nothing, Errol. And both Politico and Punchbowl out this morning, and Johnson himself did an interview last night where he highlights this, basically say that Speaker's in a fight for his job, a new fight for his job just 5 months in. I want you to listen to what he said last night about this effort from Marjorie Taylor Greene to basically have a new vote for House Speaker. This is how he feels about it.
How does this motion to vacate help win back the majority or win a bigger majority?
I don't think it does. And I think all of my other Republican colleagues recognize this is a distraction from our mission. Again, the mission is to save the Republic. And the only way we can do that is if we grow the House majority, win the Senate, and win the White House. So we don't need any dissension right now.
He's sort of saying that with a smile, Errol, but I feel like he may not be smiling inside.
Well, that's right. The thing is, he's going to have to bare his fangs. He's going to have to snarl a little bit and really finally push back against this group that seems determined to wreck the Republican majority. I mean, they've done everything they could to show that they care more about their issues or their fundraising or whatever it is their personal agenda is than in sort of supporting the team, supporting the party, and holding on to the majority. So they're down to one vote. Now, if they're going to wait until they're underwater, when Democrats could, in fact, simply take control of the House, that would be extreme, but that's really where they're heading. Mike Johnson is going to have to face down Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, the rest of the radicals in his caucus and tell them, we're not going to do this, or you're going to have to find another speaker.
You know, Errol brings up a good point. He was sort of half smiling there, but that was more snarling than I feel like I've seen from Mike Johnson.
Absolutely. I mean, he's incredibly frustrated. He's working with a party that is actually a little more diverse than people realize when it comes to purpose in Washington. There are people who get elected from Republican districts who are sent to Washington just to throw bombs. And that's what they're doing. There are other people who realize that they're in districts where voters want to see them work with people on the other side of the party, or at the very least people within their party. Getting those two groups to get on the same page to move legislation forward has been incredibly difficult for Johnson and, quite frankly, every speaker that's come recently before him.
Eugene Scott, Errol Louis, great to see both of you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks.
Sarah?
Alex Murdaugh will be entering a courtroom for another sentencing hearing, this time for financial crimes. Murdaugh will be sentenced this morning in a federal court for stealing millions of dollars from clients and his own law firm. He's already serving 2 life sentences without parole for the murders of his wife and son. Murdaugh pleaded guilty to 22 federal counts in a plea deal with prosecutors, but now those prosecutors are asking a judge to revoke that deal after Murdaugh failed a polygraph test. Joining me now is CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson. So in my years of covering court, and I know you know this ad nauseum, polygraph testing is not admissible in court, generally speaking. However, it has been a part of this plea deal. How unusual is this in the first place?
So, Sarah, good morning. Unusual, and particularly unusual as it relates to this defendant, right? Why do I say that? You heard him testify in connection with the murder charges. Different case, different time. But certainly the judge in that case, and I think the jury certainly rejected in all respects anything he had to say. And so to place reliance upon someone and for prosecutors even to condition, right, the truth upon anything he may say is somewhat troubling. Now, having said that, I think what prosecutors wanted to do, Sarah, is they're trying to recoup money for these victims, right? You have 24 victims, you got millions of dollars.
I think there's $6 million unaccounted for at this point.
Yes, and so what they're trying to do is say, hey, look, dish to us about where this money is, who, if anyone, helped you, and we will work with you. At the end of the day, though, what's the incentive? As you noted at the outset, he's serving 2 life sentences. Right. He's got 27 years on top of that, right? And because of he pled guilty, let's remember, last November to state federal crimes. And so, yes, it's unusual polygraph, particularly unusual as to Murdaugh. I'm not surprised there's an issue with the polygraph test.
I do want to ask you what happens if the judge looks at this, looks at the fact that he failed a polygraph test and blows up the deal, the plea deal that he's made. What happens next?
Right. So under normal circumstances, it would be very concerning. Plea deals are something that, right, a person takes accountability for. You go in and you know what the expectations are. You know what the parameters are. In this case, federal government saying we'll run your sentence concurrent to the state time and we'll limit it to 22 years. In this case, again, what's the incentive? You have a person already serving these multiple life sentences, and so the judge could, right, give him a harsher sentence. So what? You're in already. The judge could delay the sentencing till they get more information with respect to the polygraph, but at the end of the day, it doesn't have the gravity, Sarah, the consequence that it would be on someone else because of his past history.
I do want to ask you about what Murdaugh's attorneys are saying about this polygraph test and him failing it. They said, quote, "It appears that the polygrapher designed the relevant question in such a way to ensure that Murdaugh would fail the final exam." What do you think of that defense? Is the judge going to buy this?
Perhaps not, and maybe the judge, and they're also, Sarah, saying, they being the defense attorneys, that we want to evaluate the underlying issues and questions in the polygraph itself. What the defense is alleging, that they trick their client, that is Mr. Murdaugh, by talking about Jaron Vandersloot, right? You might remember him in connection with another case, Natalie Holloway, talking to him about other things, that is the polygrapher tricking the client. To what extent did that influence the polygraph test? At the end of the day, if any other people are sought in connection with these financial crimes and there's not corroboration other than Murdaugh, prosecutors are in trouble anyway. Let's see what the judge does, and we'll know soon. 10 a.m.
This case just keeps going and going and going. So many crimes, so little time. Thank you so much, Joey Jackson.
Always.
I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Sarah.
John.
Right, new exclusive reporting this morning about a stunning security breach in Russia. Hackers claim to have stolen the information of more than 800,000 prisoners in Russia, hoping to find out what happened to Alexei Navalny. The day after the opposition leader's death, the anti-Kremlin hackers broke into a database and found the names and contact information of prisoners held in the same penal colony as Navalny. But they did not stop there. Let's get the very latest. CNN's Sean Lingus has this exclusive reporting. Sean, tell us what happened.
John, this was a very interesting case. As you know, in the aftermath of Navalny's death, there was condemnation from Western leaders around the world, various people reacting in different ways. The vigilante hackers that I talked to decided to act in the way that they knew they were capable of doing, and that is compromise the security of the Russian prison system's computers. Basically, they hacked into an online food store where prisoners and their families can buy food that they can't get in detention. And in there, they found data on some 800,000 people, including the prisoners themselves, including the penal colony where Navalny was held in the Arctic penal colony way up there north in Russia. So this was a stunning breach, and it was fairly trivial for the hackers to get into the system. They provided compelling evidence to CNN that they were able to do that. They plastered Navalny's photo on the website of the prison system and said, this is our revenge. Now, it's somewhat symbolic. However, as you alluded to, they're sharing data with CNN and perhaps other journalists after this in a hope to find out more about what happened to Navalny. We parsed through a lot of the data and were able to confirm its authenticity, but it could be a while before we have more clarity on what the data holds exactly. But this is the latest, John, in the long line of so-called hacktivism incidents during the Russia-Ukraine war, where politically motivated hackers decide to make a statement and often have an impact on the discourse around the war. Around the time of the invasion, shortly after the invasion 2 years ago, I interviewed a Ukrainian man who leaked a lot of data on a Russian cyber criminal gang in retaliation for their support for the Kremlin. So this is the latest in a series of politically motivated hacking incidents, John.
Yeah, Russia under attack in this case. Sean Lingus, thank you very much for that reporting. Sarah?
All right, a rare public appearance for King Charles, who's undergoing treatment for an unknown type of cancer. He led the royal family to Easter church service at Windsor Castle on Sunday, but two major senior royals were not there. Prince William and Princess Catherine of Wales missed the service, both sticking close to home as they said they would after she announced last month she's undergoing chemotherapy after her own cancer diagnosis. Let's get right to CNN's Max Foster, who is in London for us. There were a few surprises. This most significant outing that King Charles made since his diagnosis, and he looked quite well as he's going along.
He really did. I met some of the sort of royal well-wishers who normally gather outside these events in the hope of catching a glimpse of the king, but we weren't expecting to see him at all. It's meant to be a very restricted service because he's going through this treatment. They want to protect him. In the end, clearly the doctor's advice had changed because a few members of the public were actually invited inside, and you can see quite a group of them by the end there. So they were able to see him, and then he came outside the church afterwards and went over and shook hands with them, noticeably without gloves. I know this sounds very detailed, Sarah, but he's being told by doctors he cannot expose himself to potential illnesses, and they're clearly confident enough to let him do that. So it really does show that he's recovering well. A source actually said to me this was, of course, a very...
...on Gaza are expected to resume today. Axios is reporting officials will hold a virtual meeting to discuss the Biden administration's alternative options to an Israeli military ground offensive in Rafah. Netanyahu has so far not been swayed from going forward with that ground offensive in Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians have fled to try and survive the war in Gaza. Now, at the same time, Netanyahu is facing one of the largest protests in Israel since the war began. Thousands of Israelis took to the streets over the weekend and this morning demanding Netanyahu resign. Netanyahu says he will not call early elections, insisting that would only benefit Hamas and paralyze Israel. Joining us now, CNN Global Affairs and analyst Kim Dozier. Thank you so much for being here. This virtual meeting comes after the U.S. allowed a UN Security Council resolution last week calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all hostages to pass by abstaining from the vote. Netanyahu was very unhappy with that and announced he was canceling the meeting at the White House a day later. Can you give us some sense of what we're expected to see and hear in these virtual talks?
Well, look, from the Biden administration's point of view, they know that for Netanyahu, continuing the war and being able to tell his people that we have gotten every high-level Hamas leader and we have dismantled the tunnel structure beneath Rafah, that's what Netanyahu needs for his political survival. So the Biden White House knows they've got to find a way to safely do this, or as safe as possible, because with the political winds that Netanyahu is facing, he's not going to stop. And the majority of Israelis, they don't trust Netanyahu, according to recent polls, but they trust the Palestinians less. And while they're protesting Netanyahu's government, they're not yet protesting the war in Gaza. And I think you'd only see that if every last hostage had been returned.
I did want to ask you about the Israeli protests because they are massive. They're really, really, really large and the largest we've seen since the war began. Will there be any pressure to have Netanyahu change tacks in any way? I know that most of the pressure is to try to get the hostages out.
Well, this is the first of several planned days of demonstrations, and the Netanyahu government had faced this kind of protest before the October 7th attacks over its attempts to change the way the judiciary operates and the way high court judges are chosen. So there was already this unrest resident in much of the Israeli population, but right now he's facing opposition from both the left, the middle, over the handling of the hostage situation, and the right over a local issue. Right now, Israel's High Court has stripped away the government's ability to pay Haredi, these are ultra-religious Jews, for studying instead of serving in the military. So that could dissolve Netanyahu's government and trigger new elections if the right wing of his coalition pulls out. But if they don't, he can stay in office for 3 years until the next elections officially take place.
And just to sort of round that out, there has been a long-standing, for many